$87,000. I want you to look at that number. Not the way you look at a number in the news, something large and distant and belonging to other people's lives. I want you to look at it the way I looked at it on a Tuesday morning in October when it arrived in my mailbox in an envelope I almost did not open because the return address was a law firm I did not recognize, and I had been ignoring unfamiliar mail for months. Because grief does that to you, it makes the ordinary administration of life feel like something you can defer indefinitely. I almost deferred it. I am glad I did not. $87,000. That is what my daughter said I owed her. Not a stranger, not a landlord I had rented from at arm's length with a lease and a security deposit and the clean contractual distance of a business arrangement. My daughter, Renee, 41 years old, whom I had raised, whom I had sat up with through childhood fevers and teenage heartbreaks and a first marriage that ended badly, and a second one that I had my reservations about from the beginning and kept mostly to myself because she was my daughter, and I trusted her to know her own life. Renee, who had called me 6 weeks after her father's funeral, 6 weeks after I buried my husband of 31 years, 6 weeks after the casseroles stopped coming and the neighbors stopped checking in, and the particular brutal quietness of a house that used to have 2 people in it settled over me like weather, who had called and said, in the voice of a daughter who loves her mother and cannot stand the thought of her alone, "Come stay with me. You shouldn't be alone right now. Come." And I had gone. Of course I had gone. I was 66 years old and I had just lost the person I had shared every ordinary Tuesday with for 31 years. And my daughter called and said, "Come," and I packed 2 suitcases and I went. That was 3 years before the envelope. 3 years of living in the guest room of my daughter's house. 3 years of Sunday dinners and school pickups for her children, and the slow, uneven work of rebuilding a life after the kind of loss that rearranges everything. 3 years of believing because she had invited me, because she had said come, because there had been no lease and no discussion of money and no indication, not once in 3 years, that the room I was sleeping in was anything other than what she had offered it as. 3 years of believing I was a mother staying with her daughter, not a tenant. Not a debtor, not a woman who would one day stand in a courtroom and listen to her daughter's attorney argue that the bedroom I had grieved in and healed in and slowly, carefully begun to live again in had been worth $2,400 a month, and that I owed every cent of it going back to the first night I slept there. $87,000. For the room my daughter told me to come to. My name is Harriet. And I'm going to tell you everything about Renee, not to destroy her. I want to be clear about that even now, even with the bitter clarity of a woman who has been through the legal system and out the other side, and who has earned the right to be done softening her own story for the comfort of people who weren't in it. I am not telling this story to destroy my daughter. I am telling it because what she did has a name. And the name deserves to be said out loud. And because somewhere in the world right now there is a woman who is grieving and alone, and whose child is saying, "Come, you shouldn't be alone," and I need that woman to hear this story before she packs her suitcase. Get a piece of paper in writing, I mean that. But we will get there. First, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. I want to know who is in this room with me today. And I have a question for you right now before we go any further. Before I tell you about Renee's husband, Derek, before I tell you about the attorney's letter, before I tell you what happened in that courtroom. Have you ever done something for someone out of pure love, with nothing asked and nothing expected, and had them hand you a bill for it later? And leave your answer below, because that is what this story is about. And if you are not subscribed, do it now. Because Harriet is just getting started, and so is the truth. Let me tell you who I was before the envelope, because I think it matters, because the woman who almost did not open that letter on a Tuesday morning in October was not always the woman you are looking at now. the one with the bitter clarity and the courtroom behind her, and the particular tiredness of a person who has been fighting for 3 years and is only recently beginning to understand what winning actually costs. Before all of it, I was Harriet Louise Beaumont, 66 years old, retired elementary school librarian, 31 years married to a man named Franklin, who was, without qualification or caveat, the best person I have ever known. We lived in a house on Camellia Street in Mobile, Alabama, that we bought in 1987 for reasons that had more to do with the name of the street than with anything practical. I had always loved camellias, the specific extravagance of them, the way they bloom in winter when everything else has given up, and Franklin had looked at the listing and looked at me and said that settles it without another word. That was Franklin. He was a man who understood what mattered to me and treated it as though it mattered to him too, not as a performance of consideration, but as the genuine expression of a person who had decided, somewhere early in our marriage, that my happiness was part of his happiness, and that this was not a sacrifice but simply the arithmetic of loving someone correctly. I taught myself not to take that for granted. I did not always succeed, but I tried every day, and I think that counts. Franklin worked for the city of Mobile for 28 years. Utilities department, the unglamorous, indispensable work of making sure the water ran and the lights stayed on, and the ordinary infrastructure of a functioning city held together behind the scenes. He retired in 2018 and spent the following 4 years doing the things he had always said he would do when he had time. The woodworking he had been collecting tools for since 1995, the garden that had been a theoretical garden for decades, and that became, in retirement, an actual one, with tomatoes and collard greens and a fig tree he was inordinately proud of, and that produced, in its first productive year, more figs than 2 people could reasonably consume. We ate a great many figs in 2019, and I am telling you about Franklin in this much detail because I need you to understand what I lost in February of 2022. Not just a husband, the word husband does not contain it. I lost the person who had been the organizing principle of my daily life for 31 years. The person across the breakfast table, the person whose habits and preferences and small routines had become so woven into the texture of my own days that when he was gone the texture itself changed, became something I did not immediately know how to inhabit. A life that was still mine, but that felt, in those first weeks, like a garment that no longer fit correctly. Franklin died of a heart attack on a Sunday morning in February. He had been in the garden. The fig tree was still dormant. He had been out there checking on it anyway, the way he always did in late winter, armed with the patient optimism of a man who understood that the thing he was waiting for was coming whether he checked or not, and who checked anyway, because the checking was part of the pleasure. He was there, and then he was not. And I was 66 years old and alone in a house on Camellia Street with 31 years of shared life and a dormant fig tree, and the specific, consuming silence of a person who has just understood that the word widow applies to her now. Renee called that evening. She was the first of my 2 children to call. My son Gerald, who lives in Denver, called 20 minutes later. And both of them said the things that children say when a parent calls with news like that, the right things, the loving things, the things that arrive from genuine feeling rather than obligation. I do not doubt that. And I have never doubted that either of my children loved their father. Whatever has happened since, whatever Renee became in the years that followed, she loved Franklin. The grief in her voice that Sunday evening was real. I held on to that for a long time. In the months after Franklin's funeral, I stayed in the house on Camellia Street because it was mine, and because leaving felt wrong, and because grief counselors and well-meaning friends and the general consensus of people who have read something about bereavement all suggest that you do not make major decisions in the first year. You stay, you breathe, you let the shape of the loss become familiar before you start rearranging things around it. I stayed. Renee called every few days. Gerald called on Sundays. Friends from church came by. The casseroles arrived and then tapered off and then stopped, the way casseroles do, because the world has its own timeline for grief, and it is considerably shorter than the actual timeline, and there is nothing to be done about that, except to understand it is not personal. It was the 6-week mark when Renee called with the invitation. I remember exactly where I was. At the kitchen table, the same table where Franklin and I had eaten breakfast for 20 years, with a cup of tea I had made, and not drunk because making tea had felt like the right thing to do, and drinking it had felt like too much effort. I was looking at the fig tree through the kitchen window, still dormant. He had not lived to see it bloom that year. Renee's voice on the phone was warm and certain in the way that Renee's voice had always been warm and certain when she had decided something. She was not a woman who proposed ideas tentatively. She came to you with conclusions and presented them as the obvious answer to a problem you had both been circling. It was a quality I had always recognized in her, had sometimes found overwhelming, and had mostly found reassuring, the particular reassurance of a daughter who takes charge. "Come stay with me," she said. "You shouldn't be alone right now. The kids would love having you. Derek and I have talked about it. Come. Derek and I have talked about it." I want you to hold that phrase. I want you to keep it somewhere accessible while I tell you the rest of this story because it becomes relevant. The fact that Renee did not call me on an impulse, did not extend the invitation in a moment of spontaneous love, and then have to negotiate it with her husband afterward. Derek and I have talked about it. They had discussed it. They had arrived at a conclusion together. They had decided, jointly, that Harriet should come. I did not think about that phrase for another 2.5 years. I should have thought about it immediately, but I was 66 years old and 6 weeks widowed, and my daughter was saying come, and the fig tree was dormant in the garden of a house that felt too large and too quiet and too full of the specific gravity of a person who was no longer in it. I packed 2 suitcases. I want to tell you about who Renee was before Derek, because I think the before matters as much as the after, and because I am trying, in this telling, to be fair even where fairness costs me something. Renee is my firstborn. Born in 1983, 14 months before Gerald, the two of them so close in age that people sometimes asked if they were twins, and Renee, from the time she was old enough to understand the question, always corrected them with the specific indignation of a child who has a very clear understanding of her own singular identity and does not appreciate having it blurred. She was bright, determined in the way that some children simply are, as though the determination arrived with them rather than being taught. She was the child who decided at 7 that she was going to learn to play piano and practiced without being reminded, and performed at her first recital with the focused calm of someone who had prepared thoroughly and knew it. And she was the child who made her own Halloween costumes, not because I asked her to, but because the ones in the store were not quite right, and Renee had opinions about what right looked like, and the patience to achieve it. I was proud of her. I am still proud of her, in the complicated, grief-adjacent way that you can be proud of a person whose choices have caused you significant harm. The pride and the wound live in the same place, and I have stopped trying to separate them. She married the first time at 26 to a man named Thomas, who was gentle and sincere, and somewhat adrift in the way of a man who has not yet figured out what he wants from his own life. The marriage lasted 4 years. It ended without drama, which I think surprised both of them. They had expected it to be harder than it was, and the relative ease of its ending was its own kind of sadness. The sadness of 2 people realizing that what they had was not quite enough to be worth the difficulty of saving. Thomas and I still exchange Christmas cards. I mention that because it is relevant to what came after, because the contrast between Thomas, who was gentle and adrift and easy to remain friendly with, and Derek, who was none of those things, tells you something about the particular vulnerability of a woman who has been through one failed marriage and is ready to believe, when the next person arrives, that the confidence and certainty she was missing the first time is the thing she needs. Derek Simmons came into Renee's life in 2016. She was 33, he was 44. And he was a commercial real estate developer, not wildly successful, I would later learn, but successful enough to present the appearance of success convincingly, which in Derek's world amounted to the same thing. He was the kind of man who filled a room not with warmth but with mass, with the specific gravitational pull of a person who is entirely comfortable being the most certain voice in any conversation, and who has organized his life around that certainty being deferred to. Renee found this attractive. I found it concerning from the first dinner. I kept my concern mostly to myself because she was my daughter, and I trusted her to know her own life. I said once, carefully, that Derek seemed like a man who was accustomed to things going his way, and Renee said, with the warm certainty that was her mode. That's not a flaw, Mama. That's just confidence. And I let it go. I let it go. I should have said more. I do not know that it would have changed anything. Renee at 33 had her own gravity, her own direction, and my opinion was one data point among many, and not the most weighted one. But I have thought about that conversation, that one careful, insufficient conversation, more times than I can count in the years since. They married in 2017, a large wedding, Derek's preference, 300 people, a venue that cost more than Franklin and I had spent on our first car, a level of production that felt, to me, less like a celebration of two people and more like a statement of a particular kind of arrival. Franklin danced with Renee and cried, which was the most important thing that happened that day, and I held on to that image through everything that came after. I moved into their house in April of 2022. Derek met me at the door. He carried my suitcases in without being asked, which I noted, and showed me the guest room, which was comfortable and bright and had a window that looked out onto the backyard where my grandchildren, Renee and Derek's two kids, Maya, who was 9, and Cooper, who was 6, were playing in the last of the afternoon light. I unpacked my 2 suitcases. I hung my clothes in the closet. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and I looked at my hands and I thought about Franklin checking on the fig tree in the dormant February garden, and I breathed. And then I went downstairs and helped Renee make dinner. Because that was what you did. Because that was what mothers did when their daughters said, come. And because I had no reason, not yet, not for a long time, to understand that the dinner I was helping to make was the first meal of a 3-year arrangement that my daughter's husband had already decided, before I arrived, had a dollar value attached to it, $2,400 a month, every month, from the first night. I want to tell you what those 3 years actually looked like. Not the version Renee's attorney presented in court, the version where a woman occupied a bedroom and a bathroom and consumed utilities and groceries for 36 months without contributing $1 toward any of it. That version exists in a legal document, and it is, in the narrow technical sense of containing some facts arranged in a particular order, not entirely fabricated. But it is not the truth. If the truth is more complicated and more specific, and I am going to give it to you in the specific, because specific is the only thing that holds up in a room full of people who have decided in advance what they believe. I moved in April of 2022. By May, I was doing the school run every morning, not because anyone asked me to, because Maya was 9 and Cooper was 6, and both of them started school at 7:45, and Renee and Derek both left for work before 7:30, and the gap between those two facts was a problem that had previously been solved by an after-school care arrangement that cost $600 a month, and that quietly, without discussion, stopped being necessary once I was in the house. $600 a month, gone from their expenses, from the first month. I also cooked. In not every night, Renee cooked on weekends, and Derek occasionally produced elaborate grilled things on Sundays that he treated as significant achievements, and that the children received with the diplomatic enthusiasm of people who understood that the cooking was as much about Derek as it was about the food. But Monday through Friday, on the nights when Renee came home at 6:30 and Derek came home at 7 and nobody had thought about dinner, I cooked. Because I was there, because I had always cooked, because feeding people is one of the primary languages of care that my generation learned, and that does not simply switch off because your circumstances have changed. I cooked 5 nights a week for 3 years. I also cleaned. Not in the comprehensive, scheduled way of a professional housekeeper, but in the continuous, ambient way of a person who lives in a space and maintains it, because maintaining it is simply what you do. The dishes that appeared in the sink while Renee and Derek were at work, the laundry that accumulated, the bathrooms, the floors, the particular archaeology of a household with 2 school-aged children that generates, on a daily basis, a quantity of disorder that requires constant management if it is not going to become something else entirely. I managed it. I also gave Renee money, not rent, not a formal contribution, money in the way that mothers give money to daughters. Pressed into hands, added to grocery bills, handed over at the school supply store in August when the list was long and the budget was tight, transferred electronically on the months when I could see, without being told, that something was strained. A 300 here, 500 there. Once, when the water heater failed in January of 2023 and the replacement cost was $2,200, and Derek's expression at the dinner table that night had the particular tightness of a man calculating something unpleasant, I wrote a check for half of it without being asked. $1,100 for the water heater in my daughter's house, the house where I owed $2,400 a month in rent. I want to pause here and let the arithmetic of that sit with you for a moment. Derek's attitude toward me was not hostile in the beginning. I want to be accurate about this because I am trying to tell the truth, and the truth includes the parts that are inconvenient to a clean narrative. In the first months, Derek was not hostile. He was not warm. Derek was not a warm man. A warmth was not in his register. He operated in the frequencies of competence and authority, and the particular social ease of a man who is comfortable in rooms where he is the most important person. But he was not hostile. He was tolerant. I understood in that first year that I was being tolerated, that the invitation had been extended and was being honored, and that the honoring of it had a quality of effort to it that was different from how Renee experienced my presence. Renee was genuinely glad I was there. I believe that. She liked having me in the house, liked having her mother down the hall, liked the school runs being handled, liked coming home to dinner, liked the particular continuity of a household that had a person in it all day who cared about its functioning. Derek liked the outcomes. He was less interested in the source. And the first time I understood that Derek had a specific feeling about my presence, not tolerance but something with more edge to it, was in September of 2022. 5 months in. I was in the kitchen making lunches for the following day, a thing I did every Sunday evening so that the Monday morning chaos had one fewer moving part. And Derek came in for a glass of water and stood at the counter and watched me for a moment and said, "You know, Harriet, most people in your situation would be paying their own way." I looked at him. "Most people in my situation," I said. "Staying with family," he said. "Using the space. It's not nothing, is what I'm saying." I looked at him for a long moment, and then I looked at the 12 sandwiches I had been making for his children's lunches, and I said, with the specific, uneven tone of a woman who has been a librarian for 30 years and who has considerable experience managing the behavior of people who are testing the limits of what she will accept. "Derek, I make your children's lunches every Sunday night. I drive them to school every morning. I cook dinner Monday through Friday. I cleaned your bathrooms this week and last week and the week before that." A pause. "I am not sure what paying my own way looks like to you, but I would encourage you to think carefully about what this household looked like before I arrived and what it looks like now." He looked at me. He said nothing. He took his glass of water and left the kitchen. We did not discuss it again, but it did not go away. And I could feel it the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure, not seeing the storm but knowing it is somewhere in the direction you are heading, knowing that the stillness has a quality to it that is different from ordinary stillness. Derek's tolerance had curdled into something that had not yet found its form, but that was looking for one. I could feel it in the way he spoke about the guest room when his brother visited in November and needed a place to stay. The pointed comment about space being at a premium. In the way he occasionally mentioned, in the conversational shorthand of a couple, things about his own parents' retirement situation, their independence, their insistence on maintaining their own household, mentioned it in a way that was clearly not about his parents. I said nothing. I kept making the lunches and driving the children and cooking the dinners and cleaning the bathrooms and transferring money to Renee on the months when the tightness at the dinner table told me to. Because Renee was my daughter and I had been invited, and because the alternative, returning to the house on Camellia Street, which I had kept, which sat waiting for me with Franklin's tools in the garage and the fig tree in the garden, felt in those first 2 years like more than I was ready for. I was not ready to go back to being alone. That is the truth of it, and I am not ashamed of it. The falling out happened in January of 2024, 21 months after I moved in. Not over anything large. That is the thing about the falling out that I have turned over many times since, trying to locate the adequate cause. To the proportionate trigger for what followed. It was not large. It was a Sunday dinner. Derek's brother Raymond and his wife had come over, and there was a conversation at the table about a property Derek was developing, a commercial project on the east side of the city, and Raymond made a comment that suggested the project was behind schedule and over budget, and Derek corrected him, sharply, publicly, in the specific tone of a man who does not accept being contradicted at his own dinner table, and I said, without thinking, without calculating the cost of saying it, Raymond might have a point, Derek. It's been mentioned before. The table went quiet. Renee looked at me. Derek looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, not the tolerant neutrality of the first year or the curdled resentment of the second. And something colder than either of those things, something that had been waiting. Harriet, he said, I don't think this is your conversation. I've been listening to it for 40 minutes, I said. At some point it becomes everyone's conversation. He did not respond. The dinner ended earlier than planned. Raymond and his wife left with the strained cheerfulness of people who want very much to be somewhere else. Renee walked them out and came back in and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read. Part apology, part warning, part something else that I have spent the following months trying to name. Mama, she said. I know, I said. He doesn't like being... I know, Renee. She looked at me for a moment. Maybe we should talk, she said, about the arrangement. About what makes sense going forward. I looked at her. All right, I said, let's talk. We did not talk that night, or the following week. The conversation that Renee had proposed hovered in the house like weather, acknowledged but not yet arrived, while Derek's coldness settled into something permanent, and Renee moved between us with the careful navigation of a woman trying to manage two people who have stopped being able to manage each other. And then, 8 weeks after the Sunday dinner, the envelope arrived. Not a conversation. Not, Mama, we think it's time for you to find your own place. Not, Mama, here is what we need. It's not any of the versions of this discussion that a mother and daughter who love each other might have had across a kitchen table with honesty and difficulty, and the specific grief of an arrangement that has run its course. An envelope from a law firm I did not recognize, with a return address I almost did not open, $87,000 for the room she told me to come to. The letter was 4 pages. I want to tell you that I read it calmly, that the librarian's discipline held, that the 30 years of managing difficult situations with a level voice and a still face served me in that moment the way they had served me in 1,000 smaller moments, across a career spent in rooms full of people who needed something from me. I did not read it calmly. I read the first paragraph standing at the mailbox in the cold October morning in my coat, and I went inside and sat at the kitchen table, Renee's kitchen table, the table where I had made 12 sandwiches every Sunday night for 21 months. And I read the rest of it with my hands not entirely steady, and the specific roaring quality of silence that arrives when something lands so far outside the range of what you thought was possible that your mind needs a moment to expand to contain it. 4 pages. Let me tell you what they said. The letter was from a firm called Simmons & Croft, 2 attorneys based in Mobile, whose names I did not recognize and whose website I would look up 40 minutes later and find to be a small but apparently functional practice specializing in, among other things, landlord-tenant disputes and civil debt recovery. Landlord-tenant disputes. I was the tenant. The letter stated that Harriet Louise Beaumont had occupied a private bedroom and shared bathroom at the property located at 4412 Magnolia Drive, Mobile, Alabama from April 2022 through the present date, a period of 36 months without payment of rent or any formal tenancy agreement. 36 months, I counted back from October. April 2022 to October 2024 is 30 months, not 36. I noted this immediately, the librarian's instinct for the precise number, and I noted it again in the margin of the letter in the pen I had picked up from the kitchen counter without thinking, the pen I had used to sign the check for the water heater, in the pen that lived in the ceramic holder Franklin had made in a pottery class in 2003 that I had brought with me in my 2 suitcases, because it was one of the small objects that still felt like him. 30 months, not 36. They had added 6 months that had not happened. The claimed rental value of the room was stated as $2,400 per month, described in the letter as consistent with fair market rates for comparable private bedroom accommodations in the Mobile metropolitan area. This figure had been, the letter noted, determined by reference to a market analysis conducted by a real estate professional. A real estate professional. Derek was a commercial real estate developer. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The man who had determined that my room was worth $2,400 a month was a commercial real estate developer by profession. The man who had retained Simmons & Croft on behalf of himself and his wife Renee, my daughter, both of them listed as plaintiffs, was a man whose entire professional identity was organized around the valuation of property. He had not arrived at $2,400 casually. He had arrived at it the way he arrived at everything, deliberately, professionally, with the specific confidence of a man who knows exactly what he is doing, and has arranged the facts to support the conclusion he had already reached. The total claimed was $87,000. I did calculations on the back of the second page. 30 months at $2,400 is $72,000. And 36 months at $2,400 is $86,400. $87,000 is neither of those numbers exactly. I looked at the letter again. There was an additional line item I had initially passed over, interest. They were claiming interest on the outstanding amount at a rate described as reasonable and customary, accruing from the date of first occupancy. Interest. On the rent I had not known I owed. On the arrangement my daughter had described as, "Come, you shouldn't be alone." I put the letter down on the kitchen table. I looked at Franklin's ceramic pen holder, and I thought about the timeline. Because here is the thing about that letter that took me a moment to understand, and that once I understood it, rearranged everything I thought I knew about the previous 21 months. And the letter was not a response to the Sunday dinner. The Sunday dinner had been in January. This letter was dated in September, a full month before it arrived in my mailbox, a full 8 months after the Sunday dinner. 8 months. Simmons & Croft had not been retained in anger, in the hot reactive aftermath of a dinner party confrontation. They had been retained 8 months later, deliberately, after a period of time that was long enough to be preparation rather than reaction. Long enough to commission a market analysis. Long enough to calculate interest. Long enough to add 6 months to the occupancy period and see if I noticed. And then I thought about something else. Derek and I have talked about it. Renee's words on the phone in April of 2022, before I packed my suitcases. May before the school runs and the sandwiches and the water heater check. Derek and I have talked about it. They had discussed it. They had arrived at a conclusion together. I had assumed the conclusion was, let's invite Harriet to stay. I understood now that there may have been a second conclusion, that the invitation and the claim had perhaps been, from the beginning, 2 parts of the same plan. That the warmth of "come, you shouldn't be alone," and the coldness of $2,400 a month were not contradictions, but a sequence. Step 1, Step 2. I do not know if that is true. I have never been able to prove it, and I am honest enough to say that I cannot be certain. What I know is what the letter said and when it was written, and that the man who signed his name to the complaint as co-plaintiff had been, from the first evening I arrived in that house, a man who understood the dollar value of space. I picked up my phone. I called Gerald first, my son, Denver, the one who called 20 minutes after Renee on the Sunday evening in February when Franklin died. I called him because I needed to tell someone before I called the person I actually needed to call, which was an attorney, and because telling Gerald first meant that when I made the attorney call, I would have already said the words out loud once, and they would have lost some of their power to undo me. Gerald answered on the second ring. I told him about the letter. The silence that followed was the silence of a man who is very carefully not saying the first thing that came to his mind. "Jerry," I said, "say what you're thinking." "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "oh, that Derek Simmons has made a very significant mistake." "Yes," I said, "and I'm thinking you need a lawyer today." "Yes," I said. "Do you want me to come?" I thought about that. "Not yet," I said. "Let me make some calls first." I hung up with Gerald, and I sat for a moment, and I thought about what I needed, not what I wanted. What I wanted was a conversation with my daughter that I was not going to be able to have, not then, not in the way I needed to have it, because the conversation I needed was the one where Renee looked at me and explained how we had arrived here, and that conversation was not going to happen on the telephone on a Tuesday morning in October with a 4-page letter from Simmons and Croft on the table in front of me. That conversation, if it happened at all, was going to happen later, after the lawyers. I called my church first, not for spiritual counsel, for a referral. 30 years in a congregation means 30 years of accumulated knowledge about who in the community does what well, and the woman I called, a deaconess named Ruth, who had known me since before Renee was born, and who had the specific, unsentimental competence of a person who has seen a great deal and wasted very little time being shocked by it. Ruth gave me 2 names without hesitation. "The second one," she said, "Beverly Tran. She handled my cousin's situation last year. She does not lose." Beverly Tran. I called her office at 11:15 on a Tuesday morning. Her assistant put me through within 10 minutes, which I took as a good sign. The offices of attorneys who cannot afford to be kept waiting tend to be the offices of attorneys who do not keep their clients waiting either. Beverly was 53 years old, a civil litigation attorney who had been practicing in Mobile for 25 years, and whose voice had the specific, grounded quality of a person who has heard most things and is not going to be derailed by any of them. I told her about the letter. "Read me the claim amount," she said. $87,000, I said, a pause. "And the basis?" "Unpaid rent, $2,400 a month." They're claiming 36 months, but it was 30 months. I counted. "You counted," she said. "I'm a librarian," I said. Something shifted slightly in her voice. Not a laugh, something adjacent to a laugh. and the sound of a person recalibrating toward a client they have just understood better. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning, don't leave anything out." I told her everything. The phone call in April of 2022, the 2 suitcases, the school runs and the sandwiches and the cooking and the cleaning and the water heater check. Derek's comment in the kitchen about paying my own way. The Sunday dinner in January. The 8 months between the dinner and the letter. The 6 extra months in the claim that had not happened. The interest on rent I had not known I owed. Beverly listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do you have any documentation of the contributions you've described? The school runs, the cooking, any of it?" I thought about it. "I have bank records," I said. "The transfers I made to Renee, and the check for the water heater." "Good," she said. "That's good. What else?" "Text messages," I said. "Renee and I texted about the school pickups, about groceries, about the children's schedules. It's all there." "How far back?" "The entire time," I said. "I don't delete messages." Another slight shift in her voice. "Harriet," she said, "I need you to go through every text conversation you had with your daughter and your son-in-law during those 30 months, and I need you to screenshot everything that relates to your role in that household, every message about the school run, every message about dinner, every request they made of you, every thank you they sent." A pause. "Can you do that?" "I can do it today," I said. "Good," she said. "I'll see you Thursday." I hung up. I looked at the 4 pages on the kitchen table. And I thought about Renee. Not about the lawsuit. I had moved past the lawsuit, or at least into the part of it that was Beverly's problem. The part that had a process and a timeline, and the particular forward motion of a legal matter that has been handed to a competent person. I thought about Renee herself, about whether she knew about the 6 extra months, about whether she had read the letter before it was sent, or whether Derek had handled it the way Derek handled most things, as his decision, in his timeline, with his conclusions, and whether my daughter had understood fully what she had put her name to. I did not call her. I wanted to. The wanting was specific and persistent and entirely consistent with 30 years of being her mother. The instinct to pick up the phone and close the distance between us, to say, "Renee, what is this?" to give her the chance to explain. I did not call her, because Beverly had said don't contact them directly, and because even without Beverly's instruction I understood, in the bitter, clear way that I was learning to understand things, that the woman who had put her name on that lawsuit had already had her chance to call me. She had had 8 months. She had sent a lawyer instead. I put the letter in a folder. I started screenshotting the text messages. There were 412 of them. Beverly's office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Government Street that had the specific, unhurried solidity of a place that had been doing serious work for a long time and did not feel the need to announce it. No marble lobby, no receptionist behind a glass wall performing the theatre of importance. Just a waiting room with good chairs and current magazines, and the quiet industry of a small practice that was fully occupied with the business of its clients. I arrived Thursday morning with a folder and a flash drive. The folder contained the 4-page letter from Simmons and Croft, my bank records going back to April 2022, a copy of the water heater check, and a written timeline I had constructed the previous evening at the kitchen table in the house on Camellia Street. I had gone back to my own house the day after the letter arrived, packed a proper bag this time, and returned to the place where the fig tree was, where Franklin's tools were still in the garage, where the silence was my silence, and not the silence of a house I was apparently renting at $2,400 a month. In the flash drive contained 412 screenshots. Beverly looked at the flash drive. "You did all of this since Tuesday," she said. "I told you I'd do it that day," I said. She put the flash drive in her computer. She read for a long time. I sat across from her, and I watched her face the way I had learned to watch faces in 30 years of working with the public, the librarian's particular skill of reading what people are actually thinking underneath what they are choosing to show. Beverly's face was professionally still, but not entirely. There were small movements, small recalibrations, the face of a woman reading something that is confirming what she expected and occasionally exceeding it. She stopped on one screenshot and looked at it for longer than the others. "What is this one?" I said. She turned the screen toward me. It was a text from Renee, dated June of 2023, 14 months into my stay. It said, "Mama, I don't know what we would do without you here. Derek said last night the house has never run this well. The kids are thriving. I just want you to know we see it and we're grateful." I had forgotten about that one. Beverly turned the screen back. "Derek said the house has never run this well," she said. "That's what it says," I said. "In June of 2023, she said. 14 months in?" "Yes," she made a note. "And there are more like this?" she said. 40 or 50, I said. I flagged the ones where either of them explicitly acknowledged what I was doing in the house. Beverly looked at me with the expression of a person who has been doing this work for 25 years and who has learned to calibrate her expectations accordingly and who is, in this moment, recalibrating upward. "Harriet," she said, "I want to tell you something about this case." "Go ahead," I said. "What Simmons and Croft have filed is not without legal basis," she said. "In the absence of a formal agreement, a lease, a written arrangement of any kind, a court could find that an occupancy arrangement carries an implied rental obligation, particularly over an extended period. That is the theory they are working from, and it is not frivolous." I nodded. "However," Beverly said, and she said it with the specific weight of a woman who has been saving that word, "the counter-argument is considerably stronger than their argument. What you have documented here is not a tenancy. It is a reciprocal domestic arrangement in which you provided substantial, quantifiable services in exchange for accommodation. The school transportation alone, $600 a month, 30 months, is $18,000. The cooking, the cleaning, the childcare, the financial contributions. A court is going to look at this evidence and struggle to characterize you as a non-paying tenant." I looked at her. "How much did I contribute?" I said. "If we put a number on it." Beverly looked at her notes. "Conservatively," she said, "between the school-run savings, the documented financial transfers, the water heater, and a modest valuation of the domestic labor, conservatively, Harriet, you contributed somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000 worth of services and money to that household over 30 months. $40,000 to $50,000 against their $87,000 claim. The gap was real. I was not going to pretend the gap was not real. But the gap was considerably smaller than Simmons and Croft had anticipated when they sent a 4-page letter to a retired librarian they apparently believed would not count the months or check the math or arrive at her attorney's office 3 days later with a flash drive containing 412 screenshots. "There's something else," Beverly said. She pulled up another screenshot. This one was not a text from Renee, it was a text from Derek, dated August of 2023. 16 months in, sent to me directly. Derek rarely texted me directly. Our communication was almost entirely through Renee, which was itself a fact Beverly had noted with interest when she saw the volume of my messages with Renee compared to the handful with Derek. This message said, "Harriet, can you pick up Cooper from soccer at 4? Renee's stuck in a meeting and I'm in Birmingham. I had picked up Cooper from soccer. Of course I had." Beverly looked at me. "He texted you directly," she said, "requesting childcare." "He did," I said. "The man who is now claiming you were a non-contributing tenant," she said. "The same man," I said. Beverly made another note. "I'm going to write a response to Simmons and Croft," she said, "outlining our counterposition and the documentation we have. Before I do that, I want to ask you something." "Ask," I said. "What outcome do you want?" she said. "Not legally. I know what the legal options are. What do you actually want from this?" I sat with that question for a moment. "I want it dismissed," I said. I want it gone. I don't want a settlement that implies I owed them something I didn't owe. I want a court or a process or whatever the right mechanism is to look at what I contributed to that household and say, no, this claim does not hold. Beverly nodded. And Renee, she said quietly. I looked at the window. That's separate, I said. That's not something a court can fix. She nodded again. All right, she said, let's build the response. I called Renee that evening. Beverly had not told me not to, and she had said don't contact them directly in the context of responding to the legal claim. She had not said don't call your daughter. And I had been a mother for 41 years. And whatever was happening in the legal space between us, there was a conversation that I needed to have that no attorney could have for me. Renee answered on the fourth ring. The extra rings told me something. Renee always answered quickly. She was a woman who kept her phone close and who responded to communications promptly. It was one of her professional habits that had carried into her personal life. 4 rings meant she had seen my name on the screen and taken a moment before she picked up. She knew why I was calling. Mama, she said. Her voice was different. Not cold, not the studied neutrality of someone who has decided to maintain a position. Complicated. In the specific complication of a person who is in the middle of something, they understood differently when they started it. Renee, I said, I have a lawyer. A pause. I know, she said. Then you know this conversation is not about the legal part, I said. Beverly can talk to Simmons and Croft. That's what lawyers are for. A pause. I am calling because you are my daughter, and I need to understand how we got here. Silence. Not the silence of a person who has nothing to say. The silence of a person who has too much and does not know which part of it to start with. Derek felt, she began. Renee, I said, I am not asking about Derek. I am asking about you. A longer silence. I know it looks bad, Mama, she said finally. It doesn't look bad, I said. It is bad. There is a difference, and I think you know the difference, and I think I deserve you to say it plainly. I heard her exhale. He built a case, she said. Over months. He kept records. He documented things. He had conversations with people I didn't know he was having. And when he came to me with it, she stopped. When he came to you with it, I said. He made it sound reasonable, she said. He made it sound like he said it was about establishing boundaries, about the fact that there was no agreement, about protecting ourselves legally. A pause. He said it wasn't personal. I sat with that. It wasn't personal. The $87,000 bill to the woman who drove his children to school every morning and cooked his dinners and wrote the check for the water heater and was sleeping in his guest room 6 weeks after she buried her husband because his wife, my daughter, had said, come, you shouldn't be alone, not personal. Did you read the letter before it was sent? I said. A pause that answered the question before she did. Derek handled it, she said. I closed my eyes. Derek had handled it, and Renee had let him. That was the truth I had to sit with. Not just that Derek had built a case and retained lawyers and claimed 6 months that hadn't happened, and calculated interest on rent I didn't know I owed. All of that was Derek, and it was monstrous, and I was going to let Beverly handle every inch of it. But Renee had let him. Renee had seen her name on that filing and had not called me. Had 8 months in which to pick up the phone and say, Mama, Derek wants to do this. I need to talk to you about it. Had 30 months of my cooking and my school runs and my Sunday night sandwiches, and had put her name on a document that called me a non-paying tenant. That was not Derek. That was my daughter. Renee, I said, I need you to hear something. Mama, I need you to hear it, I said, and then you can say whatever you need to say. She was quiet. I came because you asked me to, I said. I came because you said, come, you shouldn't be alone. And I was alone, and I was 66 years old, and I had just lost your father, and I trusted that the invitation meant what it sounded like it meant. I drove your children to school for 30 months. I cooked dinner 5 nights a week. I cleaned your house. I gave you money when things were tight, and I wrote a check for your water heater, and I loved your children, and I tried to stay out of Derek's way, and to make myself as useful and as unobtrusive as a woman living in someone else's house can manage to be. A pause. And your husband built a legal case against me while I was doing all of that. And you let him. Silence. I'm sorry, Mama, she said. Her voice had changed. The complication had resolved into something simpler and sadder and more honest. I know, I said. I didn't think it would. I know, I said again. We sat in silence for a moment. What happens now? She said. Now Beverly talks to Simmons and Croft, I said, and we find out what Derek's case actually looks like when the other side has 412 text messages and a water heater receipt. A pause. 412, she said. I don't delete messages, Renee, I said. Another silence, smaller this time. The silence of a woman realizing, belatedly, what her husband had not accounted for. I said goodbye. I hung up. I sat in the house on Camellia Street with Franklin's pen holder on the table in front of me, and I looked out at the garden where the fig tree was, bare in the October cold, waiting for the season to turn. I had a lawyer. I had 412 text messages. And I had, for the first time since the envelope arrived, the specific settled feeling of a woman who knows exactly where she stands. Beverly's response letter went out on a Monday, 12 pages. And I want to note the symmetry of that because I noted it at the time. Simmons and Croft had sent 4 pages to a retired librarian they had apparently assessed as unlikely to respond with anything requiring significant legal attention. Beverly sent 12 pages back. Not because length is the point, Beverly was not a woman who confused volume with substance, but because the substance was there, and it required the space it required, and Beverly was not in the habit of compressing her arguments for the convenience of opposing counsel. She called me the morning it went out. It's sent, she said. What did you say? I said. I said that the claim of unpaid tenancy is without merit, that the occupancy arrangement was explicitly invited by the plaintiffs, and that the period of occupancy was characterized from the outset not as a rental, but as a family arrangement in response to a bereavement. A pause. I also said that our client contributed documented services and financial support to the household during the period in question with a combined value that we are prepared to quantify in detail, and that we look forward to presenting this documentation in whatever forum the plaintiffs prefer. Whatever forum they prefer, I said. Yes, said Beverly. I want them to know we are not afraid of a courtroom. She also included in the letter a formal request for discovery. Discovery, the legal mechanism by which each side in a civil matter is entitled to request documents and information from the other. Beverly had explained it to me on Thursday with the patient precision of someone who understands that her client is intelligent and wants to understand the process fully rather than be managed through it. Discovery meant that if Simmons and Croft wanted to proceed, we were going to get to see everything. Derek's records, his documentation, the timeline of whatever case he had been building in the months and years before the envelope arrived. Everything he had handled. I had agreed without hesitation, because I had 412 text messages and a water heater receipt, and 30 years of not deleting things. And because I wanted to know what Derek had. The response from Simmons and Croft came back in 2 weeks, not 12 pages, 3. Beverly called me after she read it, and I could hear in her voice the particular quality of a person who has assessed an opposing document and found it lighter than expected. They're pushing back on the valuation of your contributions, she said. They're arguing that domestic services provided voluntarily within a family context don't constitute compensable value under the implied tenancy framework. What does that mean? I said. It means they're arguing that because you chose to cook and clean and drive the children, because nobody put it in a contract, it doesn't count as payment. A pause. It's not an unreasonable legal argument, But it has a problem. What problem? I said. It applies equally to their side, she said. If voluntary domestic arrangements within a family context don't create legal obligations, and then the absence of a rental agreement cuts both ways, you can't simultaneously argue that her cooking doesn't count as payment and that the lack of a lease creates a payment obligation. Another pause. They built their case on an implied agreement. We're going to use that implication against them. I sat with that. The architecture of Derek's argument had a load-bearing wall that was also holding up our counter-argument. He was a real estate developer. He should have seen that coming. The discovery process began in November. What came back from Derek's side over the following 6 weeks was illuminating. Not because it contained surprises, exactly. By November, I had spent a month sitting with everything I knew and everything I had inferred, and the picture I had assembled was already close to complete. But there is a difference between inferring something and seeing it documented, between understanding that something happened and holding the paper that proves it. Derek had started keeping records in September of 2022, 5 months after I moved in. Not a month after I moved in, not from the beginning, 5 months in, which placed the beginning of his documentation effort approximately 2 months after Renee's June text message. The one Beverly had stopped on longest, the one that said the house has never run this well, the one that was now in our discovery file with Beverly's notes in the margin. I thought about the sequence of that, June of 2022. Renee texts me that the house has never run so well, and Derek is grateful. September of 2022. Derek begins keeping records. Something happened between June and September. I do not know what it was. I have turned it over many times, and I have a theory that the June text, or something like it, a conversation or a moment, or the accumulation of 5 months of watching his household function at a level it had not previously achieved, crystallized for Derek something he had been vaguely considering into something specific. That the gratitude Renee expressed in June arrived at Derek as a calculation, as the recognition that what I was providing had a dollar value, and that the dollar value was accruing without a corresponding obligation on my part to eventually settle it. That is my theory. I cannot prove it. What I can prove is what the discovery documents showed. Derek had kept a log, not a diary. Derek was not a diary man, nothing so personal or unstructured as that. A log, a document on his computer. He produced as part of discovery and timestamped from September 2022 that recorded in brief businesslike entries the dates and nature of what he characterized as Harriet's use of the property. October 4th, occupant used vehicle to transport children to school. October 9th, occupant prepared dinner for household. November 2nd, occupant present in property during business hours. Occupant. He had been calling me occupant in his private record since 5 months after I moved into his guest room. Beverly had flagged that word in the discovery documents and written one note beside it. The note said, useful. Because the log, which Derek had apparently constructed as evidence of my non-contributing occupancy, was going to be read by a court alongside the text messages. Alongside the June text that said, Derek is grateful. Alongside the August text that said, Harriet, can you pick up Cooper from soccer? Alongside the November text where Renee asked me to handle the parent-teacher conference because she had a work conflict and Derek had a site visit. The log said occupant. The text said, we couldn't do this without you. Beverly filed our full documentation package in December. 412 screenshots, organized chronologically and cross-referenced with Derek's log entries, so that every date on which Derek had recorded Harriet's use of the property could be matched to the communications from that same period in which his wife or he himself had requested, acknowledged, or expressed gratitude for the things Harriet was doing. October 4th in the log, occupant transported children to school. October 3rd in the text, Mama, can you do the school run tomorrow? Derek has an early call and I have a breakfast meeting. October 9th in the log, occupant prepared dinner. October 8th in the texts. Mama, would you mind doing dinner tomorrow? I won't be home until 7. His documentation and their requests, 1 day apart, 30 months of them, a call and response so consistent and so thoroughly evidenced that the portrait it painted was not of a non-paying tenant, but of a household that had organised itself around a woman's contributions, and then attempted to retroactively characterise those contributions as nothing. Beverly called me the week after the filing. I've heard from Simmons and Croft, she said. And? I said. They want to talk, she said. About? I said. Settlement, she said. And I looked at the fig tree through the kitchen window. It was December, still bare. The specific patient bareness of a tree that knows what it is doing and is simply waiting for the season that belongs to it. No settlement? I said. Beverly paused. Harriet, she said, with the careful tone of an attorney who respects her client and is also her client's attorney. A settlement would resolve this faster, it would be less expensive, and given the strength of our documentation, we could likely negotiate the claim down to something very small or zero. I know, I said. But, she said, Derek Simmons called me occupant for 30 months, I said, in his private records, while I was driving his children to school and cooking his dinners and writing checks for his water heater. And he called me occupant and he hired lawyers and he added 6 months to the timeline and he charged me interest on rent I didn't know I owed. I paused. I want a judge to look at what he did. I want it in a record. I want it to be a thing that happened officially rather than a thing that went away quietly because settling was easier. A pause. All right, Beverly said. And then, because she was Beverly, for what it's worth, I think you're right. The hearing was scheduled for February, 4 months after the envelope, almost exactly 2 years after Franklin died in the garden. In the weeks between December and February, I called Renee again. Not about the case. Beverly had been clear that substantive conversations about the legal matter needed to go through the attorneys, and I was not going to compromise our position. But there was something I needed to say that was not about the case, and that I had been carrying since the October phone call. Renee answered on the second ring this time. Mama, she said. I'm not calling about the lawyers, I said. I know, she said. I had thought about what I wanted to say for a long time, had composed it and revised it in my head across many evenings in the house on Camellia Street, sitting at the kitchen table with Franklin's penholder and the December dark outside the window. I had a version that was long and a version that was short, and I had decided, in the end, on the short one. Because Harriet is a librarian, and librarians understand that the right words in the right order do not need to be many. I need you to know something, I said, and I need you to hear it as your mother. I not as the other party in a civil matter. She was quiet. I understand that Derek drives this, I said. I understand that the man you married has a particular relationship with leverage and with money, and with the specific satisfaction of turning situations to his advantage. I have understood that about Derek since the first dinner. A pause. What I need you to understand is that whatever Derek drove, you were in the passenger seat. You saw the road, you knew where we were going, and you did not say stop. Silence. That is what I needed to say, I said. Mama, you don't have to respond, I said. I'm not asking for anything from you right now. I just needed you to hear it from me directly, so that it is not something that lives only in my head. A long pause. I hear you, she said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who is not going to cry on the phone, but who is also not entirely in control of whether she cries on the phone. Okay, I said. I love you, Mama, she said. I sat with that for a moment. I know you do, Renee, I said. I hung up. I sat in the house on Camellia Street, and I looked at the bare December garden, and I thought about what it means to love someone and still hold them accountable for what they have done. Whether those two things can live in the same place at the same time, I had spent a year now understanding that they could. The hearing was 8 weeks away. Beverly was ready. So was I. The hearing was on a Wednesday, February the 12th. Almost exactly 2 years to the day since Franklin died in the garden checking on the fig tree. I noted the date when Beverly's assistant called to confirm it, and I sat with it for a moment. The specific, strange mathematics of grief and its anniversaries. The way significant dates accumulate until the calendar becomes a map of everything you have lost and everything you have survived. I had survived a great deal in 2 years. I put on the navy blue dress I had worn to Franklin's retirement party in 2018. Not as a statement. I am not a woman who orchestrates her appearance for symbolic effect. That is not my mode. I put it on because it fit correctly, and because it was the right weight for a February morning, and because when I looked in the mirror, I looked like a woman who knew who she was. That was all I needed. My friend Claudette from church arrived at my door at 7 in the morning with coffee, and the specific calm of a person who has decided her job today is to be exactly what her friend needs. She drove me to the courthouse. She sat in the gallery. Beverly met me in the corridor outside the courtroom at 8:45. She was in a charcoal suit with the focused, contained energy of a woman who is prepared thoroughly and is not thinking about anything except the next 2 hours. She looked at me. She looked at the navy dress. "Good," she said. We went in. The courtroom was not dramatic. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect courtrooms to be dramatic. The high ceilings and the wood paneling and the gavel and the specific theatrical weight of justice being administered in a formal space. And this courtroom was functional, medium-sized, fluorescent lighting that was doing its best. Rows of seating that were perhaps a third full, with people waiting for other matters on the same docket. Derek and Renee were already seated at the plaintiff's table. I had not seen Derek since January of the previous year, the Sunday dinner, the confrontation over Raymond's comment, the expression on his face that had been waiting for an occasion and had found one. He looked the way men like Derek look when they have decided that a situation is beneath them, but are required to be present in it. Contained, slightly impatient, the posture of a man who has other places to be. Renee did not look at me when I came in. I did not look at her. And I sat down beside Beverly, and I put my hands flat on the table, and I looked at the front of the room, and I waited. The judge's name was Honorable Sandra Watkins. 60 years old, appointed to the bench 11 years earlier, with the kind of face that has learned to remain entirely neutral in the presence of other people's conflicts, and that achieves this not through absence of feeling, but through the discipline of long practice. Beverly had told me about Judge Watkins in our preparation sessions, that this judge had a particular impatience with cases she characterized in her written opinions as opportunistic litigation, which was Beverly's polite way of telling me that this judge had seen Derek's type before. Simmons and Croft were represented in the room by the Croft half of the partnership. Robert Croft, 50-something, silver-haired, in the practiced ease of a man who has been doing civil litigation for a long time and who has stopped being visibly nervous about any of it. He nodded at Beverly when we came in. She nodded back. The brief professional acknowledgement of two people who are about to spend 2 hours opposing each other and who have no personal feelings about it. Judge Watkins took the bench at 9:15. She looked at the case file. She looked at both tables. "This is a claim for unpaid occupancy," she said. "Plaintiff alleges 36 months of non-paying tenancy at the rate of $2,400 per month. Defendant disputes both the characterization of the arrangement and the stated period of occupancy." She looked up. "Let's begin." Croft opened. He was good. I might want to give him that because I am trying to be accurate about what happened, and accuracy requires acknowledging when the other side does something competently. Croft's opening was clear and organised and hit the legal points in the right order: the absence of a formal agreement, the extended period of occupancy, the market rate analysis, the principle that using someone's property without compensation creates an implied obligation regardless of the familial relationship. He was good. He was also working with what he had. And what he had, as Beverly had identified in December, was a load-bearing wall with a structural problem. Beverly's opening was 11 minutes. She said 3 things. She said that the occupancy was not tenancy because it was explicitly invited in response to a bereavement, without any discussion of compensation, by the plaintiffs themselves. She said that the defendant had contributed documented services and financial support to the plaintiff household during the period of occupancy, with a combined value that we would demonstrate exceeded the claimed rental amount. And she said that the plaintiff's own contemporaneous communications, sent by the plaintiffs to the defendant during the period of occupancy, would show that the arrangement was understood by all parties to be a reciprocal family arrangement and not a rental. Then she sat down. Croft called Derek first. Derek on the stand was Derek everywhere else, composed, certain, the gravitational pull of a man entirely comfortable with his own authority. He answered Croft's questions with the measured precision of someone who had prepared for this, and who was not going to be rattled by the formality of a courtroom because formality was Derek's natural environment. He described the arrangement, the guest room, the utilities, the groceries, the 36 months of occupancy. He said 36 months without visible hesitation, which told me he had not noticed or did not care about the discrepancy I had caught in the kitchen with the letter. He described the market rate analysis. He described his professional qualifications to assess rental values. He described, in the careful language of a man who has thought about how this sounds, his feelings about the arrangement, that he had welcomed Harriet initially, that the situation had become extended beyond what was originally envisioned, that as a homeowner he had a responsibility to protect the value and the use of his property. The value and the use of his property. His property. The house where his children had been driven to school every morning for 30 months by the occupant at the plaintiff's table. Beverly stood up. She had the flash drive. She did not use all 412 screenshots. She had selected 47 of them, the 47 that told the story most completely, that covered the full 30 months, that included both Renee's texts and Derek's own direct text requesting childcare. She had organized them into an exhibit package that had been submitted to the court in advance. She handed Derek a copy. She asked him to look at the first page. It was Renee's June 2022 text. The house has never run this well. Derek is grateful. Mr. Simmons, Beverly said, is this a text message sent by your wife to the defendant in June of 2022? Derek looked at it. It appears to be, he said. And is the sentiment expressed in this message that the house has never run this well, that you were grateful, consistent with your experience of the defendant's presence in your household at that time? A pause. The pause of a man who sees where this is going and does not have a good route away from it. My wife's feelings were her own, he said. I'm asking about yours, Beverly said. I appreciated certain contributions, he said. You appreciated certain contributions, Beverly said. She made a note. Not for any legal purpose. Beverly made the note because she wanted Derek to see her make it. Let's look at page 3. Page 3 was Derek's direct text, August 2023. And Harriet, can you pick up Cooper from soccer at 4? She read it into the record. She looked at Derek. Mr. Simmons, did you send this message to the defendant on August 14th, 2023? I may have, he said. You may have, she said. She made another note. Do you have a different recollection of who picked up your son from soccer on August 14th, 2023? He did not. Beverly worked through the exhibit package for 40 minutes. 40 minutes of texts and responses, requests and acknowledgements. Thank yous and favours and the accumulated, documented texture of 30 months, of a household that had organised itself around a woman's labour and presence, and then attempted to invoice her for the space she occupied while providing it. I watched Judge Watkins during those 40 minutes. Judges are trained not to show what they are thinking, and Judge Watkins was good at it. But there is a difference between a judge who is listening neutrally and a judge who has arrived at a position and is now simply completing the required procedure, and somewhere in the middle of Beverly's exhibit presentation, Judge Watkins crossed from the first category into the second. I could not have identified the precise moment. I could simply see, by the time Beverly sat down, that the judge had seen enough. Croft's redirect was brief. He tried to reframe the text messages as evidence of Harriet's voluntary contributions rather than obligations. Beverly had one question on recross. "Mr. Simmons," she said, "when you texted the defendant on August 14th asking her to pick up your son from soccer, did you text her because you expected her to do it?" Derek looked at her. "I asked," he said. "And did she do it?" "Yes." "And when your wife texted the defendant asking her to handle the school run, or prepare dinner, or attend the parent-teacher conference, were those requests made with the expectation that the defendant would fulfill them?" A very long pause. "They were requests," he said. "Requests you made," Beverly said, "of the woman you are now describing as a non-contributing tenant." Croft objected. Judge Watkins overruled him. She looked at Derek for a moment, and then she looked at her notes. The judgment came 3 weeks later, in writing, 12 pages, the same number as Beverly's response letter, which I noted with a satisfaction I will not pretend was beneath me. Judge Watkins found in our favour on all points. The occupancy was not a tenancy. The invitation had been extended freely, without discussion of compensation, in the context of a family bereavement. The defendant had contributed documented services and financial support to the plaintiff household during the period of occupancy. The plaintiff's own communications during the period in question were inconsistent with a landlord-tenant relationship and consistent with a reciprocal family arrangement. She also noted, in a section of the judgment that Beverly called unusual, she noted that the claimed occupancy period of 36 months was inaccurate, that the documented period was 30 months, that the discrepancy of 6 months was unexplained by the plaintiffs and unsupported by any evidence. She did not use the word fraud. She did not need to. The claim was dismissed, in full, with costs. Derek Simmons paid Beverly's legal fees. I want to give that sentence its own line because it deserves one. Derek Simmons paid Beverly's legal fees. Beverly called me the afternoon the judgment arrived. I was in the garden, not doing anything particular, just standing in the February cold looking at the fig tree, which was still bare, which was always bare in February, which was going to do what it was going to do in its own time, and could not be rushed. Franklin had understood that about the fig tree, had checked on it in the dormant February garden, not because checking changed anything, but because attention was its own form of care. "It's over," Beverly said. "Yes," I said. "How do you feel?" I looked at the fig tree. "Like I want to plant something," I said. Beverly laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh. It was a good laugh. "I planted a rose bush in March, not where Franklin's fig tree is. The fig tree has its place and I am not rearranging things around it. On the other side of the garden, a climbing rose, the kind that takes a season to establish and that will not be much to look at this year, but that will, if I tend it and give it time and do not expect it to be more than it is before it is ready, become something worth having." Franklin would have had opinions about the placement. I made the decision myself. That is not a small thing. I want to tell you what the last year has taught me before I close this. Not lessons in the tidy. In numbered sense, I am a librarian. I have a professional allergy to lists that reduce complicated things to bullet points. But true things. Things I know now that I did not know when I almost did not open an envelope on a Tuesday morning in October. The first true thing is this: love is not a contract, but it is also not a blank check. When someone says come, you shouldn't be alone and you go. When you show up with your 2 suitcases and your grief and your willingness to make yourself useful and your trust that the invitation means what it sounds like it means, you are not being naive. You are being a mother. You are doing what mothers do and what daughters bank on mothers doing, and there is nothing wrong with you for doing it, but get it in writing. And I mean that with the full weight of everything that happened between April of 2022 and February of 2024. Not because you should approach your family with suspicion, not because love requires a contract to be real, but because a piece of paper is not a sign of distrust, it is a sign of clarity. It says this is what we have agreed to, and it protects everyone in the room, including the people who invited you, and would never in 100 years imagine sending you a bill. Get it in writing. The second true thing: Derek Simmons called me occupant for 30 months in his private records, while I was driving his children to school, while I was cooking his dinners, while I was writing checks for his household and loving his children and trying every day to be a presence in that house that earned its place. Occupant. And I want to say something to Derek directly, and I want to say it here because I did not get to say it in the courtroom, and because Beverly, who is an excellent attorney, would have advised me not to say it there anyway. Derek. You built a case against a grieving woman using the space your wife invited her into. You kept a log. You hired lawyers. You added 6 months that did not happen and charged interest on debt I did not know existed. You called me occupant in your private records, and you sat across from a judge and described your son's childcare as a request rather than an expectation, and you paid Beverly's legal fees. I hope it was worth it. I hope whatever you were protecting, the money, the principle, the specific satisfaction of a man who turns everything into a transaction, I hope it gave you what you were looking for. Because what it cost you is not recoverable, not from me, from Renee, and I think some part of you knows that, Renee. I am not going to tell you what to do with your marriage. That is not my business, and it has never been my business. And the fact that I have opinions about Derek Simmons does not make it my business now. What I am going to tell you is this: the rosebush is planted. The house on Camellia Street is mine, and it is full and it is quiet, in the right way rather than the wrong way. And I have figured out, slowly and with more difficulty than I expected, how to be a woman living in her own life, rather than a woman living in the space that loss left behind. I am not alone. I have Gerald, I have Claudette from church, I have Beverly, who I am now paying a reasonable retainer to review any document before I sign it, and which is the best money I have spent since the rosebush. And I have Franklin's fig tree, which bloomed this year, right on time, as it always does. As things do when you tend them and give them time, and do not ask them to be more than they are before they are ready. I am Harriet. I am 67 years old. I am standing in my garden on Camellia Street, and I am not going anywhere. To everyone who stayed with me, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments right now. City, state, country, whatever part of the world has this story in it today. I want to know. And before you go, I have one question. If your child called you tomorrow and said, come, you shouldn't be alone, would you get it in writing? Leave your answer below, be honest. Because Harriet has been honest with you and you owe her that much. If this story sat with you, if any part of it found something in you that recognized it, share it. For the woman in your life who is about to pack 2 suitcases and trust an invitation that does not have a piece of paper behind it. Help me find her before the envelope does, and subscribe. Because I have more stories to tell, and every one of them is true, and every one of them belongs to a woman who deserved better, and who found, in the fighting for it, that she was exactly who she needed to be. I am Harriet. I am still here. The rosebush is planted, and I am tending it.